Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm the president of the Princeton Adult School, and I give you a hearty welcome from every member of the board of the Adult School to the first in the series this semester, the Andy Shepard Lecture Series. In the last few semesters, I've had the privilege of introducing the first speaker, and I have asked for a brief show of hands for people who have attended any of our previous semesters of lectures for the Princeton Adult School. So can I ask about that? Well, gee, that's wonderful. Just it fills my heart with joy to see so many people who are pleased enough to come back and back and back. So we will, I think, continue the trend and have a wonderful series for you. There will be during this semester. There are 2 weeks where there will be no lectures, and they are printed in the original calendar. They're on the web. If you don't have your original brochure, I'll just tell you briefly. It's going to be October the 25th. Then we don't have any access to this room because it's midterm exam week, and they use this room. So again, as I've told people before, if anyone wants to take a midterm undergraduate examination, you're welcome to come. That's October 25th, and then November 22nd, which is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, is no lecture this year. Also, you know that we had, because of scheduling problems, we had to make a switch. That we originally scheduled the speaker tonight, the director of the museum, James Stewart, was unable to talk to us tonight, and Laura Gaba also had a conflict on the date that he was originally scheduled. And so, unfortunately, both were able to switch one from the other. So, James Stewart will be on November 29th. We also want to thank the Princeton University, especially the Community Auditing Program at Princeton University's Office of Community and Regional Affairs, for their help to sponsor the use of this room. And without them, we will obviously be back at Princeton High School. Those of you who date back to the time when we had these lectures back at Princeton High, I think we all agree that at least the parking is better here than it was around the high school. And this is a great space. Also, the university apparently changed the audio system during the summer in this particular room. We've been after them for years, along with the professors who've had some problems. Professor Kadava will be using the level-door microphone, and hopefully that will work well. But if you're having trouble, especially in the back, not hearing, raise your hands, and we'll try to fix it. We've got a technical assistant here for each of the lectures who knows a lot more about that than I do. Okay, let's get down to business. It's really my pleasure to introduce Professor Edward Kadava. He is the professor of English, and I'm not going to say equally important, but very important. He's the master of Wilson College, and that's a huge commitment for any of you who know the system at Princeton University. To be chosen as a master is a 4-year commitment and a possibility of a second 4 years, and I believe you're in your 3rd year now doing it, so it's a huge commitment to be a master of one of the colleges. Professor Kadava received his MA and PhD at the University of California at Irvine, and in 1989 came to be a member of the faculty at Princeton University. He specializes in American literature and culture, literary and political theory, comparative literature, media technologies, and theory of translation. So he has a lot of interest in a lot of different fields. And before the lecture, he was telling me that he normally teaches a graduate level course on Tuesday nights, but he actually has had his graduate students come on Wednesday in order to accommodate us. And believe it or not, there are 31 grad students in this class from 10 different departments. So you can see how his interest is shared amongst so many areas. And it's on literature and film, literature and photography. So that's brought in a lot of graduate student interest. He is the author of Words of Light theses on the photography of history, along with other books, and editor of a number of magazines and articles. He has published articles on, among others, Emerson, Benjamin, Kafka, and Celan, and on topics ranging from photography, architecture, democracy, war, to memory, slavery, and the ethics of decision. He has also translated several essays, and he is currently finishing a collection of essays on the ethics and politics of mourning, entitled Of Mourning, and a small book on the relation between music and techniques of reproduction, memorization, and writing, entitled Music on Bones. He teaches regularly in the program in European Cultural Studies here at Princeton, and he is also an associate member of the Department of Comparative Literature, the Center for African American Studies, the program in Latin American Studies, the School of Architecture, and the Institute for International and Regional Studies. Professor Kadava's topic tonight is Veils and Mourning, Fazal Sheik's Widowed Images. Please welcome Professor Kadava.
Can you hear me? Everybody can hear me? Probably you could hear me even if I had it off. I'm not able to tell my voice, but you can all hear? Yes. No, you cannot. Okay, so okay. Is that better? How's that? In the back, it's okay? Okay. All right, well, hello. I'd like to thank all of you for being here this evening. I want to thank Connie Hassett for her very kind invitation to have me come and talk with you this evening, and Mark for all of his attention and kindness. He's been emailing me and making sure that everything goes smoothly. I also want to thank the Princeton Adult School program for this series. I'm very pleased to be part of it and to give this talk to you tonight. What I want to do is talk to you tonight about a project that the New York-born Kenyan Pakistani photographer Fazal Sheikh did in 2004 on widows in India. And the talk is linked to the second of three essays that I've written on Sheikh's work. And in each instance, these essays belong to my ongoing interest in thinking about what it might mean to read a photograph, in particular what it might mean to read a photograph historically. Like, how do you go about reading a photograph? I should say that as part of Sheikh's effort to expose the plight and circumstances of the widows' lives, the photographs belong to his very long-standing interest on the rights of displaced and dispossessed populations. He's a human rights photographer. From his efforts within the last 18 years to document and record the mass phenomena of the refugee in Afghanistan, Pakistan, but also Somalia, Kenya, Brazil, and beyond, to his more recent projects on the systematic oppression, displacement, and discrimination against women in India. I should say, just to give you a little information about Fazal Sheikh. He received his undergraduate degree at Princeton. He was a student of Emmett Cowan, who some of you may know was recently retired from Princeton. In 1994, he was named by the New York Times as an artist under 30, most likely to change the culture in the next 30 years. So now it's about 17 years later, so we'll see. His work has been exhibited at the Tate Modern in London, the Cartier-Bresson Foundation in Paris, the International Center for Photography in the United Nations in New York, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow. He's received the International Cartier-Bresson Grand Prize, the Infinity Award from the International Center of Photography, and the Leica Medal of Excellence. He's also received fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation and the National Endowment of the Arts, and in 2005 he was named a MacArthur Fellow. In addition, in 2000, and this will be the last detail I give you, he established the International Human Rights Series, which in collaboration with international galleries, institutions, and human rights organizations uses publications, exhibitions, and the internet to bring these issues to a broad public audience. And I should say that if you go to his website, which is just fazalsheikh.org, he has many of his projects online. You can download photographs. He has a lot of stuff that he's tried to make available, and which I think is part of the project in which he's engaged. I think what I'll do is I'll just start. And what I wanted to do is, as I said, my interest in his work, and one of the reasons that I've returned to his work time and time again, is that for me, the images invite me, and I hope they will invite you tonight, to think about the relation between images and history, and the way in which they tell us, the images themselves, as they unfold in sequence and so on, how to read them. In other words, these are photographs, I think, that together, all of them, they tell us how to read photographs. They're a kind of training manual on how to read photographs. And I'm going to try and show that to you by going through this particular project and show you how, if you follow the chronology of the images and the way in which Fazal presents the images, they instruct you on how to read them. Okay? And I say this, and now we can start with these, because each time we look at a photograph, it's a story of what the eye can see and what it cannot, of what the camera can capture and of what escapes it. To say this, however, is simply to say that our experience of these photographs is always an experience of the eye, of an eye that seeks to see where it does not see, where it no longer sees, or where it does not yet see. At every moment, we are asked to respond to a certain play of light and darkness, the light and darkness without which the eye would have no story. And we respond to the muteness of this play by inventing stories, by relating each of these images to several possible narratives. We will never know, however, if the stories we tell about what we think we see as we look will ever touch or engage the images before us. But what happens when, as is so often the case in the images that compose Fazal Sheikh's remarkable series of photographs, moksha, a photograph gives the experience of the eye over to blindness, when it leads the line of our sight toward a light or shadow that prevents us from seeing? What happens when our eyes meet what they cannot see, or when they encounter what cannot be encountered? What does it mean to read an image or a photograph? What would it mean to assume responsibility for an image or a history? How can we respond, for example, to the images and histories inscribed within the photographs that compose Fazal Sheikh's moksha? How can we begin to read them? Each detail of the photographs has its force, its logic, its singular place. A condensation of several histories, each photograph remains linked to an absolutely singular event, and therefore also to a historical date. The photographs belong to a series of photographs taken by Sheikh in the first few months of 2004 in the holy city of Vrindavan, also known as the City of Widows. They therefore must be read in relation to the history of the city, and in particular the sacred history of the city, a history that includes its being the childhood playground of Krishna. But also in relation to the way in which, as more temples and shrines were built in Krishna's name, the city became the holy place of refuge for India's thousands of dispossessed Hindu widows. Sheikh's photographs seek to evoke what the early 20th century German critic Walter Benjamin famously referred to as the tradition of the oppressed, a tradition composed of the silence of the displaced and marginalized, and the unspeakability of the traumas of the dispossessed. Like Benjamin, Sheikh seeks to enable those whom violence has deprived of expression to articulate their claim to justice. His photographs seek to enable the silence of victims, the muteness of the traumatized, to come into historical expression. To read these photographs, therefore, means to give an account of the several histories and contexts sealed within them, to respond to the innumerable experiences commemorated, displaced, and deciphered in them, to seek to reconstruct the circumstances in which they were produced, or better, of those they name or date on their surfaces. And this is what I wish to do with you tonight, to give you an example of how we might approach these photographs. To begin, I wish to return to these women, or at least to the question of what it might mean to see them. If Sheikh seeks to present to us a series of images of Indian women who have been left widows, another characteristic distinguishes them even more. They are widows who live in Vrindavan. Abandoning what was left of their lives after the death of their husbands, they have come to this holy city in order to be converted into brides of Krishna, and in this way to achieve moksha, heaven or salvation. Before we can even see these women, though, Sheikh evokes the iconography of Krishna and his women. Recalling the story that justifies their presence in Vrindavan, these images delay our encounter with the widows. I should say just very quickly, what I'm interested in is, if you buy the book Moksha, which is a book that has all of the images that belong to this project, when you open up this book, which is supposed to be portraits of widows, what's interesting to me is that when you open it up, the first thing you see are these photographs of images drawn from the story of Krishna. And so what I'm going to try and track with you is what we have to pass through in order to get to the images of the widows and why I think that's important. Recalling the story that justifies their presence in Vrindavan, these images delay our encounter with the widows. Sheikh seems to suggest that we cannot understand the images that follow without first encountering and reading the images that precede them. The story that serves as a lens through which to read the conjunction of contradictions and ambivalences that we will see in each of the photographed women. Women marked by loss, but also by the utopia of an encounter with Krishna. Women who have been displaced, dispossessed, and expulsed, but who are in Vrindavan because they believe they are at the threshold of heaven. But our encounter with the widows of Vrindavan is delayed not only by the iconographic images of Krishna that open the book, but also because Sheikh emphasizes the entry into the city. To enter moksha, he seems to suggest, is to enter the imaginary that sustains the city, to enter the city in the stories and legends that belong to its very representation. Indeed, it is not possible to view the widows without passing through a series of mediations. We must look at them with eyes that bear the iconography of Krishna, the images of utopia, or the religious beliefs that promise heaven and happiness, and that view the city in which they now live. We must look at them knowing that we are not only looking at a particular subject, a woman, an Indian woman who has been left a widow. To view the other is nearly impossible, Sheikh seems to suggest, since we must always look at her through something else, through the images that precede her, through the stories that justify her presence here, and even at the very moment in which the photograph is taken. If we wish to encounter these women, then we should follow the path of Sheikh's camera. We should go in search of them by entering the city, by tracing the path of these women who, after their experience of loss, seek shelter and refuge in this holy city, and enter the city in the same way that they have been promised an entry into heaven. Because moksha is achieved by crossing across the waters of sorrow to the farthest shore from darkness. And this is also the entry into moksha, Sheikh's book. It is necessary to cross the waters, to pass through the sorrow, and to arrive on the other side of darkness. After the images of Krishna, after the images that tell us why these women have made their journey into this holy city, we enter the city, but without being able to see anything clearly. Unlike his other images, these images are blurry, unclear, and uncertain. They are dominated by obscurity. It is difficult to discern what is in front of us. They are images that emphasize the relation between light and obscurity, between seeing and not seeing. We cannot see clearly. We do not know what we are seeing. Rather than select a fragment of reality for us, the camera instead seems to have taken these pictures by itself. At moments it would seem that it is a question of a river, and that we perhaps are crossing the waters that will carry us to moksha. At other moments it would seem that we can make out a flight of steps, perhaps a door, perhaps a column. We are confronted with an urban landscape, with an entry into a city that is deliberately like a river, like the waters that separate the sorrow and darkness of the world, and in order to transport us into light. After crossing this river that is also a city, after looking at a city that is also a river, we can look at Shakespeare's widows. And yet the first illumined image, the first high-definition image, as it were, the first portrait of this book of portraits, is the image of a woman whose identity is occulted and hidden by a shawl that covers her body and her face completely, that seems to bind her, to hold her tightly, to keep her in place. I want to emphasize the suspended moment Shake creates here. He delays our seeing one of the widows by offering instead an ensemble of images that we have to see before seeing this entirely covered subject. In order to see, he suggests, we must pass through darkness. It is not so much that darkness is a condition of light, but rather that the shadow, the blurred and uncertain vision, is a condition of vision. Shake reinforces this in his description of his initial entry into Vrindavan, when he tells us that, quote, "Our journey had been slowed by intermittent bands of mist, and as we approached the town, a dense pall of fog reduced our visibility to only a few feet. Though it was only a few hours since we had left Delhi, it felt as if we had descended through time to another era. Late that night, walking through the town still shrouded in fog, I stumbled along the passageways. Next morning, I woke very early to be out on the streets at what Hindus refer to as one of the threshold times, the moments after sunset and just before dawn. In this mysterious twilight, the streets of Vrindavan are like an empty stage from which the boy god Krishna and his gopis, the little cowgirls that always attend Krishna, have only just retired," end quote. Within this uncertain twilight zone, what is to be seen cannot be seen, unless we can begin to see that this uncertainty and indeterminacy is precisely the point. Just as we cannot see the city clearly and directly, we can never see the widows directly, since they must be seen through eyes touched by at least the history of Krishna, the history of Vrindavan as a sacred city and refuge for widows, and through the apparatus we call the camera. This is why Shake's work is, before anything else, a reflection on the conditions of seeing in general, and on the conditions of the gaze of the camera in particular. What Shake suggests here is that the experience of the photograph is always associated with a kind of delay or belatedness. No matter how instantaneous the action of a camera might be, there is always some measure of delay, always some interval of time between the click of the camera and the taking of a photograph. This is why the delay that he inserts into the beginning of this book, into the space and time between the moment in which we open it and the moment in which we first can view the widows, becomes part of a meditation on the delay built into every photograph, but also a first suggestion that sight can only take place through a series of mediations, that our eye requires these mediations in order to see, even if they also prevent us from ever seeing what is before us directly and in all its immediacy. This is confirmed in Pankaj Bhutalia's 1993 documentary of the widows of Vrindavan, also entitled simply Moksha. In the film, we hear the voice of an unseen woman recite the lines of a poem that, fragmented across the length of the film, punctuates it at various key moments. The first fragment we hear is recited during the film's opening scene, as we watch a woman going downriver on a boat, alone and in white, and seated with her back facing the viewer. As we watch the woman crossing the waters, we hear the unseen woman say, "Conjure up time, mirror the ancient story, for the past is here. Searching the streets mingled with dust, concentrated ash and sorrow, in bylanes strewn, spewed, like bones from marrow," end quote. She later adds the command and question, "Inscribe, O mother, with the ink of poverty, the story of yours etched so long ago. What could you write that was not for you written?" The film opens with an evocation of the journey across the waters of sorrow to the farthest shore from darkness. And then, like Sheikh, suggests that in order to understand the widows of Vrindavan, we should link the city and its dispossessed inhabitants to the ancient story of Krishna, which survives not only in the lives of the widows, inscribed as they are within it, but also in the streets and bylanes of the city itself. Suggesting that the widows are following a script they have inherited, the disembodied voice asks us to read the relation between this ancient script and the lives of these impoverished and dispossessed women. I want to begin to do this with you here now. While there are innumerable versions of the Krishna story, circulated in sacred poems as well as in folkloric traditions, one of the most important sources for the history of Krishna is the Bhagavata Purana, a collection of narratives, genealogies, epic stories, prayers, and hymns of praise. The celebrated Sanskrit work, probably produced in South India between the 7th and 10th centuries, was central to medieval devotional theism and to Krishnaism in particular. What is singular about the work, and something that is entirely pertinent to what I want to say here, is that it is composed of a series of narratives that are told to someone who is about to die. It is therefore organized around a meditation on death and dying. It seeks to think about how we should regard death and about the relations among death, loss, and love. The composition of the Bhagavata is itself framed by death, since it takes its point of departure from the death of Krishna. It begins right after the death of Krishna, and therefore begins at the very moment in which an era is passing away. The portrayal of death in the Purana is so pervasive that nothing or no one is untouched by it. Beyond its many scenes of literal death, the Bhagavata is filled with figurative deaths, all of which confirm separation as a major element in both Indian literature and religion. These instances of separation emphasize the sorrow that results from being apart from one's beloved or from one's own nature. This separation often is depicted as a more agonizing experience than mere death, and it includes the distance between the human and the divine, as well as the separation from loved ones. Fathers are constantly losing sons, wives lose husbands, parents lose children, and lovers lose their beloved. The entire Purana may be read as a sustained meditation on loss, and this perhaps is what secures its power and force. Rather than seeking to avoid loss, the Bhagavata not only celebrates it, but also makes it a catalyst of personal transformation. This is most clearly legible in the climactic story of Krishna and the cowherd women whom he seduces along the river. The gopis, in relation to which the poem explores the relation between love and loss and the human and the divine. In the story, the gopis had prayed to the goddess Katyayani that Krishna would become their husband. And their prayers were answered when, after stealing their clothes while they were bathing in the river, Krishna demanded that they come out from the river and approach him if they want their garments returned. Seeing the gopis without clothes, he is said to have become their husband. Whatever the case may be, from the very first verse we are warned that conventional time and space do not apply here, since it suggests that within the night there already are many nights. That the story of Krishna and the gopis leads to darkness. The name Krishna literally means dark or black. Brings us back to the story of Krishna's birth, a birth that is entirely a photographic one. As we learn in an earlier Bhagavata narrative, Krishna's birth is predicted by a star. And within the history of photography, if you read texts on the history of photography, literary writers, Baudelaire, Valéry, Proust, Benjamin, etc., within the history of photography, photography can be said to begin in the history of stars and the interpretation of stars. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that in the discussion. But it's interesting to me, as someone who thinks about the history of photography, that Krishna's birth is predicted by a star. Within this photographic context, then, Krishna is born on a moonless night in prison and under the threat of execution. He is born in a photographic space, in other words, in a dark room. in a kind of camera obscura in which, appearing in his majestic four-armed form, he is begged by the only mortal who witnesses his birth to assume a more usual appearance, and in a flash, the blinding light of divinity both strikes and blackens Krishna, who now appears as an infant. This link between Krishna and the realm of photography is suggested by Sheikh in this remarkable image of an imagistic altar to the little Krishna. Surrounded by darkness, inserted into and emerging from out of this photographic space, his representation seems situated within the aperture of a camera, but also within a kind of womb-like environment. That mothers are always another name for photography, maybe you hadn't known this before. Like the camera, they too are a means of reproduction. Suggests that the little Krishna, this little offspring of a principle of reproduction, will himself become a principle of reproduction. Something that is confirmed when he is presented as a force of multiplication, when he multiplies himself to be available with equal intimacy to every gopi he summons. A force of reproduction, he also becomes a mechanism for the production of distance and separation when he leaves the gopis behind. Like the photograph, which is always organized around the absence of the photograph, Krishna is another name for mourning, if not for photography itself. Indeed, it is perhaps no accident that the widows whom Sheikh photographs believe, as he tells us in the text that accompanies Moksha, that his photographs will be an offering to Krishna. Returning to the story of Krishna and the gopis, Krishna tells the cowherd girls that true feeling for him comes from hearing and meditation, and not physical proximity, and that they should now go home. He disappears and inaugurates what is called the Great Separation. The disappearance is sudden, and it overwhelms the cowherd women. They begin to exhibit various symptoms and degrees of loss, the first being the imitation of his activities. Becoming absorbed with him, the gopis begin to identify with him and declare, "I am he." The verse reads as follows. The beloved ones imitated the form of their beloved in his gait, smiles, glances, and words. Those women identified with him and, confounded by the play of Krishna, declared, "I am he." Krishna orchestrates his separation in order to induce the gopis to follow him. In the Bhagavata's version of the story, Krishna never returns to Vrindavan. And the cowherd women are obliged to spend the rest of their mortal lives in broken-hearted remembrance of him. In this context, then, within the context of modern Bengali life, to move forward to the period in which Sheikh is interested, the image of the Bengali widow of upper caste Hindu families has emerged as a general figure of suffering. It is not that every Bengali upper caste widow has suffered in the same way or to the same extent throughout history, or that there have been no historical changes in widows' conditions. But there is no question that widowhood exposes women to several difficulties and trials in the patrilineal, patrilocal system of kinship of upper caste Bengali society. The prescribed rituals of widowhood take the form of extreme and lifelong atonement on the part of the widow. Celibacy, dietary restrictions, unadorned bodies that carry certain marks, a lack of jewelry, a shaved head or cropped hair, white saris that signal both a relation to death and an absence of desire, white ash on their forehead, aimed not only to make widows unattractive and to set them apart from others, but also to control their sexuality. Stories recounted since the 19th century reveal the element of torture, oppression, and cruelty that often, if not always, accompanied the experience of widowhood. Among the upper castes, widowhood is a state of sexual and sexual death. What we register as we read the texts that accompany Sheikh's images is that the widows seem to experience more and more of less and less. And perhaps especially because, being widows, they are no longer who they were before their husband's death. But if identity is the condition of possibility for memory, how can those who have lost their identity memorialize anything? In answer to this question, this series of photographs attempts the impossible. It tries to produce the witness who would testify to her own non-surviving. This is why the photographs bear witness to a different kind of witnessing. A kind of witnessing in which the past is contemporaneous with its present, and in which the widow is therefore always in a moment of exile. This is where the disturbing paradox of these photographs lies. What is photographed is not a subject anymore, but it is not yet an object. The photographs are taken at the moment when the widows are exposed to their loss of self, while still preserving traces of their subjectivity. The fact that this process is captured in the medium of photography once more asserts its importance. For there is no photograph that does not expose the photographed, the one who is photographed, to objectification. Okay, that's what a photograph does. It transforms a person into an object, to a flat piece of paper, let's say. As the French theorist of photography, Roland Barthes, would have it, and this is a quote from Barthes, the photograph represents that very subtle moment when, to tell the truth, I am neither subject nor object, but a subject who feels he is becoming an object. I then experience a microversion of death. Nevertheless, it is the widow's survival, her living on, even after her social death, that indicates that things change and transform. It is this ghostly survival that defines the photograph too, since it is there within the medium of photography that we simultaneously experience the relation between life and death, and among the past, the present, and the future. Indeed, whether or not the widow is already dead, literally dead, she already will have experienced a kind of death. This point is confirmed when Neela Day, one of the widows whom Sheikh photographs, tells us that in Vrindavan, we are so determined in our determination, in our devotion, that everything else in the world is dead to us. We ourselves are dead and living with Krishna. End quote. Within the Purana, this experience of living at the threshold of death and life is another name for the experience of love. For what takes place in our relation to the one we love, even if our beloved is Krishna. And this is part of what is bequeathed to us by these stories. That what is at stake in this series of photographs is a matter of what we inherit, can be seen in all the hands that appear in Sheikh's work. Not only within moksha, in which there are many, but throughout his various projects. In each instance, whether the hands are holding something, whether they're holding each other, or resting on this or that part of a body, they imply an effort to keep and to hold, to carry and hand over, to hand down like a kind of legacy or inheritance, a fragment of the past. In this way, these hands tell us what a photograph desires. It too wishes to offer, to keep, to convey and hand over a fragment of our memory. Like the hand, it comes to us as a mode of transmission, but a mode of transmission that asks us to think about what it means to transmit or communicate, to bequeath something, to leave behind a legacy or inheritance through which a future might become possible. The photographs are about what it means to pass something down, to hand something over, a memory, a story, a death, a past, present, or future. And not only because they confirm, in however an interrupted manner, a story of inheritance and lineage, a story of the relations among mothers and daughters, for example, emphasizing the singularity of a single displacement. And we should never forget that what is ineffaceable about displacement is that no matter how many thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of displaced persons there may be, these displacements are each time singular ones. They also suggest that, like photography itself, inheritance is both a matter of singularity and repetition, a matter of the singularity of a memory and of the repetition without which there could be neither memory nor inheritance. This association between inheritance and photography also suggests that what these hands surrender to us is what is given to us by every photograph, an image. We can never remind ourselves enough that the photograph gives us an image rather than what is photographed. We could even say that every photograph turns the photographed into a kind of widow. Tearing it from its context and displacing it to another place, these photographs tell us that every image is widow, insofar as its existence is the best indication that what we have before us, what we have in our hands, is not the photograph. This is why, like Shakespeare's widows, photography exists in perpetual mourning for the person or object in relation to which it emerges. This bereavement acknowledges what takes place in any photograph, the return of the departed, of the one who is no longer here. This is why the return of what was once there takes the form of a haunting. The possibility of the photographic image requires that there be such things as ghosts and phantoms. This is confirmed not only by the fact that one widow after another dreams of her dead husband and sees him in her dreams, time and time again, as if he were alive, but also by the shadow lives that the widows themselves lead. It is perhaps precisely in death that the power of the photograph is revealed, and revealed to the very extent that it continues to evoke what can no longer be there. In photographing someone, we know that the photograph will survive her. It begins even during her life to circulate without her, figuring and anticipating her death each time it is looked at. This means that there is no photograph, no image, that does not reduce the photographed to ashes. As Man Ray wrote in 1934 in an essay entitled The Age of Light, images are the oxidized residues fixed by light and chemical elements of living organisms. No plastic expression can ever be more than a residue of an experience. It is rather the recognition of an image that has survived an experience tragically, recalling the event more or less clearly, like the undisturbed ashes of an object consumed by flames. End quote. Walter Benjamin makes a similar point in his essay, The Storyteller, in a passage that identifies flame with the reader. The reader is said to annihilate and devour the stuff or subject matter of a novel, as fire devours logs in a fireplace. What sustains this reader flame is no longer just wood and ashes, even if these are now transformed into a book, but a question that keeps the reader's interest burning: how to learn that death awaits us. As Benjamin notes, that the meaning of a character's life is revealed only in death means that in order to read, the reader must know in advance, no matter what, that he will share this experience of death. End quote. The living reader flame, burning over the logs of the past and the ashes of past experience, learns to read by learning of its mortality. Reading means learning to die. What Shakespeare's photographs tell us is that the earth is not a place where humanity or rights are shared. And this despite their respective and repeated claims to universality. It is instead a place of inequality and injustice, a place of loss and death, a place where every day there are more women and young girls who are abandoned and abused, who are displaced and dispossessed, who starve, who are mutilated and raped, who are marginalized and exiled, and who live without the full exercise of political and civic rights. It is a place where, because of the inequality and injustice often written into the very formulations and definitions of humanity and rights, and again, despite their associations with a certain rhetoric of universality, the task of defining and realizing human rights is infinite and therefore permanently urgent and necessary. As Sheikh writes in Ladli, which is a companion volume, in India's main cities, every 6 hours, a young married woman is burned to death, beaten to death, or driven to suicide by emotional abuse from her husband. According to the United Nations Population Fund, 2/3 of Indian women between the ages of 15 and 49 have been beaten, raped, or forced to provide sex. The fact remains that Indian society traditionally subordinates women, and its treatment of them amounts to a cultural prejudice as ingrained as any racial or religious divide. What India suffers from is apathy. It is not clearly for lack of legislation that women and children are still abused, but because of the unwillingness of the police, the courts, and the government to enforce the laws made to protect them. End quote. That India can evoke the universalism of human rights at the same time that it continues to contribute to the regime it condemns. And here it is no different than every other nation, including ours at times, is only one indication that what it means to be human by no means always counts with the same force in invocations of human rights, but also in their absence. This is why the question of human rights is a question that remains at the heart of any politics or ethics that concerns itself not only with who we are, but also with what it means to live in a world in which the call for human rights and humanitarian intervention is not always made in the name of preventing the dispossession of rights that so often defines the conditions of our human existence. If Benjamin were alive today, he might remind us that there is no document of humanitarianism that is not at the same time a document of inhumanity, inequality, and violence, and that the human rights activist should therefore dissociate himself or herself from it as much as possible. If the projects and discourses of human rights do not wish to neglect this counsel, they will have to define themselves continuously against the inhumanity, inequality, and violence that threaten them from within as well as from without. Always and at once motivated by humanitarianism and democracy, they would seek to inaugurate a world in which displacements, racisms, nationalisms, class ideologies, sexisms, and economic oppressions of all kinds would no longer exist, and would ask us to imagine what the world has never offered us: absolute freedom, justice, equality, and rights. If this world can ever be inaugurated, if there can ever be a future that will not simply be a repetition of the past, it may well be enabled by work like that of Fazl. Thank you. I think I can move around and talk with this, right? So, are there people in the room that view Fazl's work before, or maybe have looked it up, or seen his work? He will be, actually, as Mark mentioned, I'm the Master of Wilson College, and I organized a lecture series at Wilson. On April 12th, Fazl will actually come and give a lecture for Wilson College and talk about one of his recent projects. He's doing a project right now in Israel, actually. Are there questions about this work, about photography, about the relation between images and history? Yes? It's still, it is, I'm sorry? It is, yes. It's, yeah, the movie Water is, I mean, it's fictional, but it's based on these stories, yes.
Is that a widespread?
It is widespread, and it happens a lot. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this is why I think Fazl spent his time there, because he wanted to document him. He lived with the widows for several months in Vrindavan. He works with different NGO groups and different women's rights groups. And there was one woman who knew several of the widows, and so he managed to make his way through that community for several months and interview them. The book is actually quite nice because it has the images, but it also includes alongside the images excerpts from the interviews that he did with them. And this was I'll just say this is one of the things that was very interesting to me, because one of the most difficult things about working on a project like this is actually the question you're asking. I mean, the pervasiveness, the fact that this goes on, and it's very difficult to negotiate this practice. At the same time, what's interesting to me, and a friend of mine who's an Indian scholar told me this, is that the women are not only victims. I mean, in the sense that they choose to go to Vrindavan because of their relation to the story of Krishna and so on. So it's a very complicated thing. I mean, it was very difficult for me not to think of them as only victims, right? But I think that it's tricky to think about this negotiation between the way in which, that's why I cited the line from the film, where it says, what did you think you could write? You who were already written, who you were already following the script, what did you think you could do? But in that play between somebody who acts, even as they are acted upon, I think that's what's interesting. So if you look at the interviews alongside the images, what you register is that they all have a different relation to why they're in Vrindavan, even though they're all there because they're devoting themselves to Krishna and so on. So you'll read some of them say, I'm here, I'm very happy, I'm devoting myself to Krishna, I'm going to achieve salvation. And another one, I'm here, I'm devoting myself to Krishna. If my son called me tomorrow and called me back, I'd go back in a second. Right? So you get to, by looking at the narratives, you actually see that they have varying relations to the story. And I think that's interesting. Does that answer the question? No, I mean, this is a particular group, right? Not all widows go there, right? But there are tens of thousands of widows go there. So it really depends on the particular family and so on. It's not a caste issue. Women from different castes go there. And in fact, in certain cases, you wouldn't necessarily think this, but the women from upper castes are the ones who more, let's say, strictly follow the rituals and end up going there. So it's not just the ones who cannot afford to be on their own that go there. So it's a complicated setting. Yeah. Did you have your hand up here, honey?
Why did you show the face in the last picture?
I'm sorry?
Why is the face only shown in one picture rather than all?
Why is this one shown?
The face.
These are three images. There are three different images. I put them together myself to draw different images from the project. What interests me, and then I'll turn to this one, is that when you go through that sequence, and that's why I said I'm interested in how you read these images, effectively I think what he's saying is, if you want to see these widows, I mean, he's a human rights photographer, right? So he wants to show these women to us so that we can be moved to try and be activists on their behalf as well, right? He wants to change their situation. So he wants to reveal and expose the plight of these dispossessed widows. So what's interesting to me is that in a book that is supposed to show you these women, what you really get is a meditation also on the possibility of his being able to show them to you. So that what I think he's saying, and this is why I moved in the way that I did, is that if you want to see these women, if you want to understand these women, you have to pass through the story of Krishna, you have to pass through the history of this city, and even then, because the first one you see has her back to you, you may not be able to see them directly. But if you want to have a chance of seeing them, you have to go through that history in order to try and begin to understand why they're there. And so I followed that trajectory because then when you see a widow face on, you also see her through the mediation of everything that has come before. So that even when you see them directly, what he's saying is, you see this face, it's a face, but that face is also an archive. Right? It's an archive that bears the traces of all the history that has led this woman to this place. Right? So that what he's saying is that if you want to read a photograph, you have to read almost what's invisible in the photograph, which would be all the history, all the relations, the losses, etc., that have led this woman to be in this place at this moment. Yes? They do different chores in the city. Some of them do beg. Some of them do different chores in the city to get money. I mean, they don't come with money because, of course, this is part of the problem. When the husband dies, they very often get blamed for the death of the husband. And so very often they lose rights to inheritance, they lose property. Very often the sons kick them out of the house. So this is why this one story is very nice. That if my son called me back tomorrow, I would go in a second. So, but yeah, they don't. They're very poor. They're very impoverished. Yes. Yes.
This program was done in 2004. Has any of the economic success in India changed any of this tradition?
I think that the question is that this project was done in the early months of 2004, and the question was whether or not the economic situation in India has been doing relatively well, whether it has changed the conditions. I think that what you see, what the difficulty there is that even with the economic progress, these rituals are still there, right? Because these rituals are linked to religious practices and so on. So it's not simply a matter of providing, let's say, resources, although it's partly that in terms of the conditions of the widows. I don't know about what has happened in the last few years. I know that Falzo was last there, I think, in 2006, and he hadn't seen anything there, but now it's been 5 years. One of the things that he did when he did this project is he also worked, as I was saying, with NGO groups and women's groups in the area, and he circulated in packages of 30 these images to different women's groups, to institutions, to schools. So it was part of an education project also to get people to talk about the plight of the widows more directly in relation to questions of rights, the rights that they were lost. So, these are, whether or not these kinds of projects have positive outcomes, one always has to see how they unfold in time. But I think that what he has tried to do is, as I was suggesting earlier, is give some voice to people whose voices were silenced in some way. Yes?
When you look at the meeting in the sixth grade, the way I've done it, when my education, look at it from formal out, first, comprehension, and mind.
Yeah.
Secondly, you go to the narrative. The narrative is non-objective, moving in taking a particular account.
Right.
And then lastly, a more specific narrative.
Right. Right. Right.
And therefore, when you go through that sequence, you're not judging the photograph, you're not judging the person in the photograph, until you get to that last stage.
Uh-huh.
By that time, you're ready to sort of
Uh-huh.
by going directly into the narrative on a very specific level,
Mm-hmm.
you bypass all that. And I don't know, I mean, I'm just saying that
Yeah, actually, I'm glad that you mentioned this, because I think I try and think a lot about how to read images, right? And one of the things that I said this as part of the material here was drawn from the second of 3 essays I wrote on his work. The first essay I wrote on his work is a piece called Palm Reading, and it focused on a series of images that he took in the winter of 97-98 along the Pakistani-Afghanistan border of Afghani refugees. And he did this under the Taliban ban against images, the prohibition against images. So he took these images in secret at night under the light of a small lamp, moving, with the Northern Alliance and so on. And I was particularly interested in a series of images of just hands. There's a series of images of just hands that are holding small photographs of dead fathers, sons, and brothers. So formally, it's just that. It's very simple. It's a hand holding a photograph. And And so when I think about how to read a photograph, I think I'll tell you how to read a photograph. And it's not so unlike what you're saying about painting. I think you have to do two things simultaneously. You have to reconstruct the context and circumstances in which the photograph was produced. And you also have to pay attention to what every single photograph does, which is it rips something out of a context. Every photograph rips something out of a context, right? So you have to, if you're trying to read a photograph, you have to simultaneously contextualize and decontextualize at the same time. And so for me, that double gesture, when I was reading the photograph, I tried to talk about the moment in which the image was taken, what the context was, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, etc., etc. But what was interesting to me is also what this image says about photography. Right? This is a photograph of a hand offering an image. And as I said in the talk, that's what every photograph does. Every photograph hands over an image. And I think it's really important because I'll often see somebody giving a talk and they'll show a photograph and say, oh, that's my uncle. And I was like, no, that's not your uncle, that's a photograph of your uncle. And I think one has to remember that the image is not what was photographed. So in that moment, when you're talking about the way in which an image rips something out of a context, then you can talk, I think, more formally about what happens, how this photograph can become an allegory of photography in general. Right? And I think that's something that one has to do simultaneously with looking at the specificity of the images. So when you're looking at a painting, I think it's very similar, that you have to reconstruct the history that is sealed in that painting, what the painter is borrowing from, what traditions of painting, what they're doing formally, and also talk about the specificity of the content. I could say much more about how I think that's related to how you read a literary text as well, but I think you have to do those two things at the same time. Yeah, back to you.
Yeah, you mentioned several talks you've given. The talk tonight vis-a-vis the males in mourning several years ago in connection with the exhibits at the University Art Museum. Was that different tonight with this emphasis on Krishna, or essentially?
It was more elaborate, longer, more detailed. But that actually it's now available on Fossil's website. If you go to Fossil's website, you can actually download all the. Well, actually, no. I think you can do maybe all three. I don't know if you can do at least two of the three pieces. You can download them from his website. Yes. Yes. The only thing that's in color, if I remember right, are the pictures of the Krishna story. He takes a photograph of those and they're in color because the images were originally in color. All of the other images, in fact, I think in all of his projects, he works in black and white. Why? I mean, he's also an art photographer, right? So I think he works in black and white. All of his photographs are black and white. Yes, here, and then we'll go up that way. Yes. Well, everywhere, yeah, so everywhere, so that everybody knows that this one is a widow, yes. Yes? Yeah, well, if you look at theories of photography and histories of photography, I mean, beginning from the speech that Arago gives in 1839 to the Academy of Sciences of Paris, he refers to the constellations and the stars, and in one theoretical text on photography after another, there's this reference to stars. And if you think of a star and what it means when you're looking at a star, you're seeing light, but it's light that might be related to a star that's already dead. So there's a way in which the light there brings together life and death. It also is the presence of the light, but it could be related to the absence of the star. So because every photograph is structured around this relationship between light and darkness, absence and presence, and so on, I think that it's very rich metaphorically in relation to the structure of the photograph in general. So I've argued elsewhere that in fact the history of photography could be said to have begun in the interpretation of the stars. And that's through a particular reading of Walter Benjamin and so on. But one theoretical discourse after another, there are always stars. And I think it's because of that. Yeah. Yes?
One of the theories that shows photograph widows at the time. It's one of the large organization that they sort of keep it for the lowest certain degree of solidarity and support. And a lot of the message that is trying to was that the Congress compared to what the minors wrote that they women treated by widows separate
You mean that to emphasize the isolation?
To really bring out the point. This way, I mean, there was a certain degree after a while when I was sort of looking at maybe before I got to one maybe like young girls who
I mean, I referred to the companion project they did called Lodley. And he did the widows, and then Lodley are really young girls. And so he said that he wanted to go from the older women to the young girls and kind of document more generally the plight of women and girls in India. This issue of the isolation versus the group is a very interesting one for me. And the most recent piece that I wrote for Fossil is a piece that introduced a collection of his portraits that just appeared in the spring. And it has, what interested me there is I thought, okay, well, I've already written 2 things on him. If I write a 3rd thing, I better do something different. And so I thought if I'm going to write on his portraits, then I'll use this as an occasion to develop a theory of the portrait in general. So what interested me is that a lot of the portraits, especially in his early work, which is focused on Africa, is that there are always other people in the portraits. So that you'll have a portrait of one person or 2 people, and there'll be, 5, 6, 7 people in the background in the distance. And that was partly linked to, a kind of sense for me of the communal character of life in these particular villages. But what I started thinking about was the way in which one could develop a theory of the portrait, which says that a portrait, even if there is only one person in the portrait, is never, is always a group portrait. And even if there's only one person in there, only one face, it's a group portrait. And that was what I tried to develop in that because it goes back to the way in which when you look at a face, that face is already an archive. And it's an archive of all the relations that have made that person who they are. And I think let me put it this way, one of the things that I was trying to figure out on a formal structural level as I was thinking about this is a theory of identity, because I was trying to think about the agency that these widows could have. And for me, it always was organized around a kind of paradox. And here's the paradox. That we are who we are because of our relations to others. But then it's precisely because of our relations to others that we're never simply just ourselves. Unless we say, I am the one who is never just myself. And I think that there's a way in which these images of just the single person in this community, because they're read, you see them one after another, and they are, as you say, they belong to community. They can be read serially in some way. So that each story that is told becomes a gloss or another way of looking at the other story that's told. And I think there's something quite nice about the communal aspect of it. And so what I would say is that I'm improvising here, if he were to take pictures of isolated girls in the streets of Calcutta who are widows and so on, there's no doubt, I think, that he would inscribe those pictures within a series of pictures that shows the shared plight of all these people. So that what is interesting to me is this play between singularity and commonality that gets staged everywhere in his work, which I think is a photographic issue. I think of every photograph is structurally organized around the relationship between singularity and repetition, just like memory. Right? Every memory is singular, but it has to be able to be repeated in order to be a memory. So I don't know if that's a way of answering, but I guess what interests me is the way in which, in his work, as I understand his work, no one would ever be very alone. It's not possible in his world. It's not possible in our world, I think. I think we're never alone, even when we're by ourselves. Yes? It's a big percentage. I think it's like 20-30%, but I have to check that. I think it's 20 to 30%. I mean, it's known as the City of Widows.
We don't have any idea what was asked. We know the
I'm
answer
sorry.
was
She was asked
20%.
if I knew what the percentage of the whole city of Vrindavan, the widows, composed. And I said I wasn't sure, but I thought it was about 20 to 30%. I'd have to check. I mean, it's significant enough to be called the City of Widows. Yes?
The story can be, it's a very sad story, obviously, because that's thousands here and
Yeah.
thousands were. What's the natural history of widows throughout? Is there a way to escape this? Do they go back to families? Do they get remarried? Is there one for that?
They're strictly speaking not supposed to get remarried. And that's why he says that they have to be celibate after the death of the husband. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is, and maybe I should say in the longer version I talk about this, this problem with this issue, let's say the problem that we can all say we have with this issue, it was never a problem in India until the British arrived. Right? When the British arrived, this becomes a problem because, of course, then they register it in a different way, right? So before then, it's not discussed as a problem. So it's only discussed as a problem after the British arrived, which is an interesting thing because then you have the encounter between two different cultures. Right? Coming in. Yeah. Fun.
You know, this want us to read these, and if I'm reading the English, it's looking at
Uh-huh.
so
They're very good. Yeah. Yeah.
and I would tell other readers of this story, just looking at this one,
Uh-huh.
they're leaning into each other.
Uh-huh.
I read that as a story about women who are friends with each other,
Uh-huh.
sisters,
Uh-huh.
but totally irrelevant to what caused shape.
I mean, they could be friends and sisters. We don't know. But see, when I started off, one of the things I said in the beginning is that when you look at a photograph, there's always this play between light and dark, and you're looking at it. And in this play, you invent a story about the photograph, and we don't always know if the story we invent matches what the photograph is. Right? We don't know. So that's why I think that if you're going to read a photograph, you have to try and reconstruct the circumstances, the specificity, the conditions, who's in it, etc. on the one hand, but then pay attention to how every photograph rips something out of the context. Every photograph does that. I mean, and that's why I insist so much on the mournful character of the photograph. Look, I mean, people have accused me of talking too much about death and mourning. So my now standard joke is that everyone bears the curse of the father's name, but when you have my last name, you're kind of condemned to talk about death. But one of the things that I always think about and tell the students is that when you have a photograph in your hand, and I said something like that in the talk, it's the best evidence that what you have in your hand is not what was photographed. So the photograph exists in relation to the absence of what was photographed. And for a photograph to work, it has to be able to circulate in the world without you. And that's why for me, the photograph is structured like a name. For a name to work, it has to be able to function in your absence. Right? So both the name and the photograph can exist as if you were no longer there. And that's why I think one theorist of photography after another will associate photography with death, because it's organized around this experience of mourning. You have the photograph, you don't have what was photographed. It's not there. Right? So it's always organized around what was once there, right? Which is why it's structured like hunting. Okay, thank you very much.